You ever do a job where the worst part isn't the pay or the boredom, but the way the place seems to be waiting for you to make a mistake? Stay with me until the end. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. And if you're alone, maybe don't turn the lights off just yet. I took night work because the day shifts paid less and the rent didn't care about my plans. Name's Alex. I was 28 when I started as the night caretaker for the municipal cemetery on the edge of town. Graveyard hours run long and slow, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 3 rounds an hour, logbook at the desk, radio clipped to my belt, a heavy ring of keys that felt like a promise if I kept them close. The old man who trained me, they called him Don Miguel, warned me once with that flat tobacco voice of his and no theatrics. You watch the lights, he said. You watch the clocks. Things like patterns. Mind your rounds. He never said anything about ghosts. He didn't have to. 10 p.m., clocked in, lights on in the shack, coffee lukewarm in a dented thermos. The first nights were mostly silence and the small arithmetic of routine. Pathways, gates, children's section, family chapels, mausoleum wings. My flashlight carved a yellow tunnel ahead of me. The beam caught on bronze plaques, low hedges, the black gleam of wrought iron. There's a smell to an old cemetery at night. Old flowers, wet earth, a faint metallic trace from the mausoleum vents. I logged each check like some nervous accountant. Gate padlocked, chapel doors latched, lights functional. Radio bleeped and received like a heartbeat. If something felt odd, I wrote it down. 11:20 p.m., chapel window ajar, secured. That entry would keep me honest when the place pressed up against the thin skin asleep. 11:15, first round complete, no anomalies. Weeks taught me the micro-rhythms, the way fog pooled at the low grounds around 3 in the morning, how the chapel clock sounded 2 ticks behind the watchtower clock, how pigeons stopped cooing where a car drove by. Then small impossibilities started to thread through my rounds. Little things at first. A single candle left on a family plot that hadn't been there when I walked past 10 minutes prior. Footprints in the soft dirt by the statue of St. Teresa where none should have been. Fresh soil scuffed without tools left nearby. 11:47, candle on plot 24, not recorded. Cleared. Smell of wax burning, no flame at time of check. I did everything the way I'd been taught. I chalked things into the log and closed the gaps. I checked cameras, ancient eyes that sometimes fed nothing but static. And I walked the circle again. There's a mental strategy that night workers develop. Treat the world as procedural. If you can name the actions, lock, inspect, note, radio, you can hold the creeping suggestion that something wants to pull you into a story. Naming it keeps it small. One night, the wind went dead. No rustle in the hedges. Every sound ill-made bounces smaller back to me, like the place was folding in around the noise. I was rounding the mausoleum, flashlight beams skimming the carved faces of names I'd never pronounce, when I heard the choir, soft, breathy, under the stones. It wasn't like a radio or someone singing. It was the shape of a voice without a source. I stopped, because any sensible person stops when a voice arrives from nowhere in a place people don't gather at that hour. 12:33 a.m. Sound reported. Location, mausoleum north wall. No other units in proximity. I radioed Don Miguel. There was the ritual of it. Miguel, 12:33, mausoleum north, possible disturbance. Static swallowed his first half sentence. When he answered, it was the way older men say things at night, granular and cautious. "Stay out of the crypts, Alex. Don't touch the candles." He didn't explain more. He never did. I tell you this because the ordinary rules were a comfort until they weren't. The second time something impossible happened, it stepped across a threshold I'd spent nights defending with pen and key. 1:02 a.m., chapel lights pulsing, investigating. I made my way back to the chapel where families sometimes left votive candles. My beam found the door slightly open, and a warm throat of light spilled across the linoleum. There were candles, rows of them, placed in front of the altar in a shape that felt like a number but was wrong. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. At the edge of the light, the heat pressed at my face. But when I reached out, the flame stopped at my knuckles. Not burning, but resisting, like a membrane. Then the choir again. Not a single voice now, but a layering, threads of whispers that braided into syllables I could almost make out. I turned slowly, hand on the heavy chapel key, and for a beat I thought someone sat in the far pews. The smell of oranges and old wax for a second. The radio in my pocket chirped once, low battery. It had full bars on my walkie, but the sound was a sober kick to my chest. I stepped back and wrote in the log. 1:05 a.m. Unexplained candle formation. Chapel auditory phenomenon. Radio glitch noted. 1:07 a.m. Voices closer. Heat on face. Log ends mid-sentence. I don't pretend I kept my calm. The next minutes are a blur of procedural motions and that odd animal logic. When the world gets stranger, you rely on what you know. I locked the chapel, sealed the doors with a bolt the size of my wrist, and tried to step away. The air thickened. The beam from my flashlight caught on something moving just beyond the doorway. A smear of pale where no person should be. The suggestion of shoulders. I called out like a man testing his throat. "Hello? Don Miguel? Anyone there?" No answer. The voice behind the chapel hummed like a radiator. Then, impossibly, a child's laugh, close enough to my ear to set the teeth in my jaw to ringing. I am telling you now, I heard a toy rattle, a plastic sound like a small wheel on stone. Different building, same hours, an empty municipal office tower slated for renovation, floors of locked rooms, and a final sealed executive office on the 6th floor. I took security for the extra cash and because the schedule fit the habits I'd inherited. The building was a relic with elevators that hummed like trapped insects and a lobby clock that never quite matched city time. My station was a small glass booth by the service entrance, a desk, a coffee maker that always leaked, a camera bank that showed grain and angles but little else. Keys again, flashlight, radio, logbook. 9:58 p.m. Shift start. Lobby lights dim. Elevator A operational. Elevator B offline for maintenance. The older man who ran the renovation crew, a different Don, this time called Ramon, offered the same no-nonsense warning. If the lift goes strange, don't take it up. He said it like a superstition he didn't want to indulge, like a superstition he'd learned from a grandfather who worked the same tower. The building had a rumor. The 6th floor was sealed because of an accident years prior. A closed office with personal items left as if someone had tea and stepped out. I assumed the workers exaggerated. That's the way rumors grow in places where men work nights and tell stories. 11:12 p.m. Perimeter check complete. Floor panels locked. Elevator B shows intermittent panel number changes. At first, the anomalies were mechanical. Elevator B flickered between numbers that made no sense, the display cycling 1, 2, 5, 3 in a rhythm that suggested a code I couldn't crack. Once, as I keyed the log, the elevator dinged and opened on the third floor to reveal no one. Just a thin fog curling in a square where nothing should be fog. The fog smelled faintly of bleach and oranges, as if someone scrubbed and then left the scent to fade. I stepped in to investigate with the flashlight. The doors slid shut on their own, and the floor indicator dove to the basement and back, a stomach-turning drop I felt behind the teeth. 12:40 a.m. Elevator anomaly. Doors closed without passenger. Fog present on third floor. Cameras fail to detect particle presence. You learn to read things in the way machines fail. Cameras picking up nothing where there should be movement. Radios that give you static instead of voices. On the third night in that building, I stood outside the service lift and watched the floor numbers blink like a heartbeat. I had the master key for the mechanical rooms and a clipboard filled with maintenance orders. Down the hall, the janitor's cart sat like a small island, mops, an orange bucket, a half-eaten sandwich. I was writing 1:03 a.m. elevator cycles when I heard footsteps above me. Not the slow, spaced steps of a human with body weight, but a patter, a child's step, quick and light, skimming the floors above. It was the third floor where the fog had curled earlier. 1:05 a.m. Pattered footsteps above. No crew scheduled. I called out, polite at first. "Hello? Is someone up top?" The answer was a slow series of clicks from the elevator's interior, like a toy winding down. Then the sixth-floor panel, which had been dark and sealed, briefly flashed. Not a normal maintenance light, a small, steady ring, white as a fingernail. 1 a.m., sixth-floor panel flicker, no access scheduled. Rationality is a muscle. You flex it when fear wants to pull you under. I told myself it was wiring or a technician with a key. I radioed Rahman. "Rahman, I'm seeing lift A bounce numbers. Can you check the access?" His voice came smooth and far. "Hold position. Do not let anyone on. There's a rule in security. If an alarm or anomaly happens, you limit variables. Don't get into the elevator. Don't chase." I waited. The number on the pad blinked 6. The doors sighed open, and there, framed in the rectangle, was an office that should have been behind sealed doors. Desk lamp on, chair pulled out at an impossible angle. Papers strewn in a way that suggested someone had left mid-sentence. I could see a cup with a lipstick mark and a photograph on the desk. My flashlight trembled. 1:13 a.m. Sixth-floor visual confirmed via elevator. Unoccupied office. Personal items present. I stepped back. The elevator doors didn't close. Instead, a breeze, warm and wrong for the sealed, conditioned building, brushed my face and carried with it the faint note of perfume and a rustle like turning pages. Then the radio died. Not static, died. Blank. My thumb on the emergency button pressed into silence. My training suggested leaving the area and calling for backup. My feet moved like they belonged to someone else. Somewhere between the vestibule and the doors, the floor tile under my shoe felt like a piano key. I felt it depress and then rebound, as if a footfall had been waiting for me. As I spun toward the stairwell, a sound slipped through.
A woman's breath, close behind me. Not spoken words, only breath. Cold at the base of the skull. 1:15 a.m. Unidentified presence proximate. Stairwell access blocked. I ran for the stairwell. The door I grabbed was locked from the other side. My key didn't fit. My key slipped from my hand, and for the first time in my nights, I heard the clatter of metal roll exactly in time with laughter. Short, without humor. A child's toy sound. I bent for the key, and a hand, impossibly pale and unformed, brushed the back of my neck. The wordless contact felt illicit and personal, like someone reading a page of me I hadn't known was there. I went to my knees in the stairwell and stayed there until the sun threatened crept at the horizon. Because the building had taught me how to move calmly in public, but not how to survive the private things it hid. When morning came and the crew filtered in, they nodded and made jokes about outdated wiring and urban legends. Rahman told me to file the incidents and the company would take care of repairs.
The camera footage, when they checked it, showed only empty corridors and the elevator closing with a common sigh. When I asked about the woman in the office, Rahman shrugged and said, "People leave things behind." But the photograph I remembered on the desk, a small family portrait, a child holding a balloon, stayed in the bright seam of my mind like something I couldn't scrub out. That job ended the night my radio came back halfway through a shift after being dead for an hour. Voices leaked through, not my team, not Rahman, but a whispering chorus layered in multiple pitches. It said nothing coherent, only a knot of syllables that felt like memory and warning. The next day, the company moved me to a daytime post with less exposure to floors that misplaced numbers. If the cemetery had been about the slow intrusion of grief and old rituals pressed against my work, the tower felt like machinery and memory hooked together. Small domestic cues in empty spaces. Keys, photographs, elevator panels, boundaries that shouldn't move but did. They taught me not to assume that an empty room is safe. There's a third place I should tell you about, and it's the one that stuck to me hardest. The call came through a temp agency. Night watch at Mercy Pediatric Wing, they said. A hospital seemed straightforward. Lights, people, protocols. I thought the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the constant presence of staff would give me an anchor. I forgot that hospitals at night are a particular kind of hollow. Machines breathing for people, curtains like thin walls, and corridors that hold sleep like a tide. My post was the clinic basement. A security desk near the staff elevator with a view down a hall that led to the children's play area and a storage room that smelled of antiseptic and orange peel cleaner. 10:10 p.m. Mercy Pediatric Wing. Shift start. Coffee weak. Badge active. The staff were different here. Nurses moved with a soft decisiveness that kept the building breathable. A night nurse named Rosa took a moment with me at the sign-in. "Listen," she said, leaning against the desk with a tired kindness. "If you hear something that sounds like a child calling for mama and there's no nurse nearby, you ignore it and call security." Her eyes were the kind that had learned to balance care and boundaries. She didn't say it like a legend. She said it like policy. 11:02 p.m. Rounds check. Playroom locked. Toy closet sealed. The first anomaly was small and human. Toys left arranged on a table in a circle when I'd seen them in a heap 5 minutes before.
The doll in the center was face up, its painted eyes staring into the fluorescent. It was impossible. The toys were behind a locked gate. Nobody had access except staff. As the night deepens, sounds in hospitals shift. Machines beep in their own rhythm, monitors tick like clocks. But this night, the monitor noise took on patterns that exaggerated the human voice.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era T present, motion recorded by Security Cam 214. Você está no meio de uma frase e pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. I walked closer because property, protocols, curiosity, all the things that kept me upright. The closer I got, the more the air smelled of oranges and hospital antiseptic, a clash that woke a memory of a hospital waiting room I'd never been in. The silhouette stepped forward and then folded into itself, like a paper crane collapsing, and the music box started up again 3 feet behind me. The tune was wrong, notes reversed, as if someone rewound memory. I ran. If the first 2 places taught me the vocabulary of unsettled nights, the hospital taught me how absence can be violent. I made it to the staff corridor and slammed my hands on the intercom. Security, we have an active... I stopped. The corridor was full of nurses now, their faces blank and professional. Rosa stood there once I finished. She had her hand on my shoulder and the steadiness of a woman who had seen 1,000 panics and reduced them back to manageable tasks. You did the right thing, she said, which is the same thing parents say when nothing can be fixed. The hospital's response was clinical and compassionate. They monitored me, offered a room, and a doctor wrote notes about acute stress reaction. The footage, when reviewed, showed a corner of the playroom empty except for chairs. But my logbook, my recorded ledger of the night, had precise entries, timestamps, descriptions, the way my pen had trembled. There's a bureaucratic mercy in written records. They make you credible and ridiculous at the same time. The last sound I remember from that place was the lullaby reversing once more as I left on the morning shift, played backwards into my ears like a warning. When I quit that night watch, people congratulated me on getting out. They said I'd done the right thing for myself. They were right, and yet sometimes when I pass Mercy Hospital now, I catch myself walking a little straighter, because there are things in the dark that learn your gait. All 3 jobs left me with the same small list of habits. I don't take night posts anymore. I sleep with a lamp within reach, and keys under the pillow feel like an insult. I don't believe I'm immune to the pull of places that keep schedules and candles and elevator numbers. The ledger of my nights read like a catalog of ways boundaries can bend. Grief left to its own devices, machinery remembering, a hospital's lullaby reversed. I am not telling you this to scare you for entertainment. I'm telling you because these are the things that changed me. They are also the things I survived. If you made it this far, you already did what I tell myself I couldn't. You stayed past the little alarm in your head. When I think back, I'm not interested in proving what I saw. I'm interested in how the world uses small details to make people stop and listen. Keys, clocks, candles, they aren't just objects. They are edges. If you ever find one of those edges in your path, treat it like a ledger entry. Name it, close it if you can. Walk away if you can. There's more I could tell you. Nights I didn't mention, where the radio went on with the clear sound of a child humming my mother's song. The time an elevator panel counted down to a number that didn't exist. The way candles in a chapel flare when you think of a name. These are the small hauntings that build a life. I still have the logbooks in a box under my bed. I don't open them often. When I do, the pages smell faintly of wax and orange cleaner, and I remember the weight of keys in my hand and the way my feet felt like they were walking on someone else's memory. I'll keep telling these because I was there, because the ledger lists it, and because some warnings need witnesses. If you work nights, lock the routine tight. If the radio goes quiet, don't take the elevator. If you find a candle that wasn't there before, write down the time and the smell and close the door. The rules are small. They make sense when the rest of the world is asleep. I've been meaning to ask, have you ever heard something in a place that should be quiet? Tell me where you heard it, what time it was. I check my messages more than I should. There were nights I didn't write down at first, because I believed the first rule of surviving strange places was to pretend nothing strange had happened. That was a childish superstition, like holding your breath to keep a lamp lit. The first ledger I kept after the diner was an accident. I'd scribbled the time and the exact words the woman at the counter used. "Do you close at 2?" Because I thought I might need it for an insurance claim if the night took something from me. The second ledger, the one that lives under my bed now, began as a way to pin down my own memory and to see whether, in ink, the rooms would shrink. Ink is patient. Ink insists on particulars, the temperature, the brand of cleaner, whether the clock's second hand trembled before the sound began. There was the night the radio started playing my mother's lullaby, clear as a bell, in a room where no radio existed. I had been alone in the reopened museum's back stairwell, cataloging a broken exhibit, and the hallway smelled like dust and varnish and the quiet of a building that closed at dawn. The lullaby was a small song she had hummed when I was 7 during a thunderstorm. People who have been away from the sound of a voice for a long time sometimes mistake a house settling for that voice. I knew the difference by then. My fingers stopped on the ledger page. The tune threaded around the banister and into a locked gallery, then died. I left the back door propped open and slept in my car outside the loading bay until the sun dragged itself over the museum's stone cornice. There was no radio. I wrote 0314 a.m., sound like mother humming, direction north stairwell, smell lemon polish, dust, effect nausea, relief, outcome closed the gallery and locked the door despite the open prop. Another night, an elevator panel counted down to a number that did not exist, -1. I stood in the hospital service elevator with a cart of linen and watched the tiny LEDs arrange themselves like a countdown to an afterthought. The doors had not yet closed. Nurses walked by in the corridor, unaware. I told one, joking because jokes save people in elevators, and she did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, like a person reading the sky. The panel went 3, 2, 1, 0, -1, and then the number blinked out entirely as if the light had been embarrassed. The elevator reached the floor I had asked for. The linen cart rattled. I wrote 0207 a.m., elevator panel, reversed countdown to non-number. Smell, hospital antiseptic, and the sharp sweetness of candy someone had left in the linen room. Effect, cold in palms, quick footsteps. Outcome, removed 2 sets of sheets that later washed out a stain I could not identify. There was a chapel night where candles flared when I thought of a name.
I was alone because chapel services end and the world resumes its breathing elsewhere. The candles stood in a small circle, prayer wax already pooled. I do not pray in the sense of a person on knees promising things I cannot know will come true. I remember the shape of prayers. They are petitions, they are bargaining, they are a way a human voice makes a small room less final. I thought of my neighbor's name, the woman who tended the ivy and left jars of syruped peaches on porches, and every flame popped like a match. When I looked away, the wax had new fingers pointing in the direction of the middle seat, where once a person had sat decades before. I wrote 01:58 a.m., chapel, candles flare on name thought. Smell, beeswax, cold metal of hymn boards. Effect, hands clasped, then empty. Outcome, close the door, left the church grounds, no sharing with neighbor. I began to map these things, a cluster in the old district, a single bright dot near Mercy Hospital, a line of smaller notations that followed the bus route on the west side of town. There were patterns, and there were exceptions. The human mind likes a map because it promises control. The ledgers did not promise control. They promised a record that could be shown, queried, folded into pockets, and carried like a talisman. People tried to help me make sense of it. My sister, to whom I owed every sensible habit I had picked up in my adult life, called one morning and said, "You are making ghosts out of habit, you know that." She was not unkind. She had a way of saying things that held a truth like a coin, cold enough to prove it was real, but small enough to slip into a pocket. I argued with her for a while. Then we both stopped and talked about a dog she had been thinking of adopting. Practical gifts of attention are underrated.
Hawza, who had the steadiness of a woman who had been asked to stitch people back together more times than an ordinary human should, offered me chamomile and a file of incident reports from the hospital. She said, "You can write the world 1,000 ways, but records make it honest." Her honesty is the same honesty I tried to replicate with my pen. Oscar, the night janitor at the train depot, gave me a different kind of help. I bumped into him at 4 a.m. when the depot was still smelling of oil and cold metal. He wore a hat with the lining frayed and a sweatshirt with the name of a company long since bought out. He had a lunchbox that seemed to contain more stories than sandwiches. "You keep a ledger, huh?" he said, as if he had read my mind. I had been careful to keep my notebooks hidden, but the towns grow small in the night. People read the tracks you leave. He took a slow sip of his thermos coffee and told me, without being asked, about the radio in locker 8 that played a song his wife used to whistle, even though the locker hadn't been opened in years. He did not use the word haunting. He used the word patience. Things wait, he said. They wait for someone to notice. Sometimes they just want to be named. Naming had become a discipline. If something hummed, I would note the song name, where it came from in the room, and the nearest person who had a connection to it. When an elevator light spoke a number that wasn't there, I noted the sequence and the smell and whether the cart had creaked. When candles flared, I noted which names I had allowed into my head. Naming was not exorcism. It was a way to sharpen the edges, to see whether an oddity was a one-off or the first in a sequence. Sometimes naming felt like cruelty. I once wrote down a child's laugh in an empty nursery at the home for veterans. The laugh was high and bright and quick, a sound so perfectly ordinary that it felt obscene in its placement. There was no child on camera. There was a set of tiny boots placed carefully on a shelf older than the carpets. I wrote 03:33 a.m., nursery,
child laugh from empty crib. Smell, baby powder and old wool. Effect, stomach lurch, sudden bitterness. Outcome, ask the night attendant if anyone had been there. He blinked and said a name I didn't recognize. He held my hand too long, as if to make sure I believed him. Sometimes people believe because they've seen it themselves. Sometimes they believe because the act of believing makes them kinder. Not all nights were violent or clever. There were nights that felt like a house remembering someone and doing it gently. In the broken bakery with a shuttered window, there would be the precise smell of cardamom at 2:31 a.m., as if a recipe were being practiced by memory alone. In a laundromat with one broken dryer, a sweater would come out still warm, though no machine had been on. My ledger is full of these small courtesies.
She was not young, and she was not old in any useful way. Her hands had the map of someone who had done things over and over. Her voice, when she spoke, was like a hinge that had been oiled, not dramatic, only practical. "You write them down," she said. "Good. People don't do that anymore." "Who are you?" I asked, and the question felt foolish even as I said it. There is a characteristic foolishness about stepping into a story on purpose. She smiled like a person who expects questions. "Call me Maeve. I've been cataloging oddities in this town for longer than I should admit. I read the ledger you left at the coffee shop." She had been at the coffee shop. That I did not know. "May I see it?" It seemed immodest to refuse. I spread the book onto the table. The lines of my handwriting looked like someone else's because, in the ledger, I became a different sort of person. The person who could be precise about the weather at 03:14, and the person who had to condense shock into a neat notation. Maeve read a page and nodded slowly. "You know what these edges are sometimes," she said. "They are places where attention was interrupted. A switch flipped wrong. A hand let go before it finished making a promise. The world keeps those split seconds like bruises." "You think they're tied to memory?" I said. "To things unfinished?" "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes they're about a thought that was never finished speaking aloud. Sometimes they're about a song that was never allowed to stop. But sometimes," she paused, and the pause was a small, careful thing. "Sometimes they are habits of the building. They learn to repeat. A hum becomes a habit. A song rewinds. You can name it. You can try to close it. Or you can learn to listen properly and see what it asks." "Ask what?" The question felt naive. "Connection," Maeve said. "Contact. Permission. Some edges, when noticed, want to be tended, like a bruise that needs cleaning. Others only want to be seen, and then they go." She spoke as if she believed in the ledger as an instrument, not simply as a catalog. She believed in tending. There is an old human idea that if you attend to a thing carefully, it will respond. It is both superstition and practice. I left that night with a new page in my ledger. 000, library meeting, Maeve, with theory of edges. Smell, old glue. Tea. Effect, uneasy hope. Outcome, agreed to meet again. We did meet again. Maeve taught me a practice that was neither ritual nor therapy, but an oddly specific adult's patience. We did not speak aloud to the edges. We wrote names and dates and events on slips of paper and left them in places that had been troubled. We sat together in waiting rooms and did nothing more than breathe until a pulse in the building eased.
For some edges, merely leaving a record was enough. The reversed lullaby in the museum did not sound the week after we left a slip in the gallery shutter with the words, "We remember, we will not be surprised."
The electric panel flinched into the proper numbers for 3 weeks after we replaced the panel's burned-out bulb with a spare Maeve produced from a bag like a conspirator. Not all fixes held. There were stubborn places that seemed to be arguing with time, and not with us. The little music box that had followed me twice, the one that had folded into a silhouette and played backwards, returned once while I was at the old train depot answering a call that was only static on my radio. The music box sat on the countertop of the closed station gift shop, as if someone had left it between other unsold things. A stack of postcards, a fly swanner, a paperweight that was rusty. The box was small and made of oak. The lid had an inlay of a dancing couple in brass. When I turned it over, the mechanism's teeth were fine and clean. I did not wind it. The tune, my mother's lullaby, spilled out anyway, backward at first, and then, as if correcting itself, forward. I placed my hand over it and waited. It stopped. I do not know what I wanted more, to smash it or to pet it. I wrote 0446 a.m., station gift shop, music box presents without winding. Smell, linoleum, pennies, cough drops. Effect, unease, then a sweat that felt like shame. Outcome, left box on counter, locked door, took the key home in my pocket. What I did with the key was a test. I did not throw it away. I placed it on the ledger's page as if to signify custody. I slept badly that night and woke with the taste of iron. The key felt heavy in my hand, an object that asked if the things we keep are the locks to other people's memories. I had the impulse to put the key under my pillow and sleep with it, like the children I had once watched with their toes curled around blanket edges, pretending the blanket was armor. Instead, I put the music box in a drawer and wrapped its key in a paper towel and buried it between pages of a book with no plot. Maeve called me reckless. "You keep things like a person keeps a lost child," she said. "You pile them into boxes and say you can protect them. You can't. But you can witness." Witnessing made me responsible in a quiet way. If you witnessed, you could not claim ignorance. You had to act or remain accountable to your inaction. Accountability is a different rod to beat oneself with. It is not a hammer, but a ledger line. Entry, effect, outcome. Someone else less kindly called it obsession. Friends grew used to my long absences and stopped asking where I had been when I returned covered in the smell of another place. A woman I had dated for a few months left a note that said she couldn't keep living with a man who worked nights in other people's stories. The note was crisp and final, and in its way, kind. My sister said, "You can't save everything. Let some things go." Rosa said, "You could rest. You are not a machine." And yet I continued. Pirpas, it is because once you begin to notice, you perceive a world vibrant with small, anxious things that had been waiting for an audience. Perhaps it is because the ledger had become a kind of faith, not in God or in ritual, but in attention. The idea that to notice is a kind of mercy. The nights increased in complexity. There was a system that emerged out of habit and stubbornness. Document, name, attempt small repairs,
Leave something tangible as proof of attention, a matchbook, a folded hymn, sometimes simply a note with the time and a request. The town was a bruised body, and we, the odd folk of the hours, were its nurses. Maeve took a corner of that duty as if she had been born to it. Oscar contributed incense and stories. Rosa offered medical eyes. I offered lists. Then, one morning in late September, a message arrived that changed the ledger's tenor. It was not a random note from someone who had heard something. It was a scanned photograph with no caption. The image was grainy and taken at night. In the blackness behind a row of unlit storefronts, a small figure stood on the sidewalk with a music box cradled in its hands. The figure's face was turned away. The music box glowed, as if lit from within. Someone had written across the bottom in a child's pen, "She keeps winding." I stared at that picture until my lids felt like curtains. The handwriting looked like the scrawl of someone small, a child's script, curved and earnest. I forwarded the image to Maeve and to Oscar, and waited. They both replied quickly. Maeve wrote, "Bring your ledger. Meet me at the chapel at midnight. There will be more to see." Oscar replied with a string of laughter and a line, "Bring coffee." I do not know that I ever stopped hoping for an explanation that would make story fit into reason. Perhaps hope is a bad word here. What I mean is that I continued to look for a pattern that was not superstition, but human consequence. That the edges were not supernatural at all, but human traces amplified by architecture and memory. If this photograph meant anything, it meant someone, maybe a child, was winding a music box in the night, and in so doing was continuing a habit that began somewhere else, in somebody's house, on somebody's lap, with the small mechanical whisper of teeth catching teeth. We met at the chapel. The candles were down to nubs. Maeve had taped a map to the hymn board, pins and red thread showing places we had been. There were new pins, too, the photograph's coordinates scrawled in a hurried hand. "She keeps winding," Maeve read aloud from the caption, and her voice did not make the words quaint. What would it mean to have someone wind the music box, she asked. To return it to motion? To rewind the record, perhaps, so that the beginning is still beginning? Maybe she likes the song, I said. The answer sounded feeble even to me. Maybe, Maeve said. Or maybe she thinks winding it keeps something good from happening. Children reason that way. If you attend to a thing, you can keep it alive. It's an old human logic. There was a second photograph in the message. This one showed a ledger like mine, a different hand, a name in the corner, Lena. The page had been photographed lying on a dais in a rec room. Lines of neat script, noting times and odors and effects. Someone else had been making lists. Lena is a name that returns in the night like the smell of frying onions in a closed kitchen. You suddenly remember where you've heard it, and it throws you back like a small wind. I did not know Elena. Maeve did not know Elena explicitly. Oscar frowned and said nothing, which in him is the sound of thought. "We are not alone," he said finally. We had known that. But the ledger that was mine, the ledger that had become a way for me to talk to myself about the world, was suddenly not singular anymore. Another person was making similar lists, leaving similar notes, and, in the photograph, Someone small had written over a picture of a winding music box, "She keeps winding." The thought came then like a sudden chill. What if these edges were not merely responsive, but communicative? What if the small habits of a town were simultaneously private and public, like a language that only a few of us remembered how to speak? What if there was a chain of attention, children and night workers and old custodians, all keeping a music box moving so that somewhere a lullaby would not stop? I wrote that in the ledger in a neat line, with the time and the place. 11:12 p.m., chapel. Photograph of child winding music box. Ledger present. Smell, cold wax and stale coffee. Effect, a feeling like surprise that had the texture of a bruise. Outcome, decided to follow up. We followed the photograph's coordinates the next night. The storefronts there had long since become blank faces. The gift shop's window held a cracked porcelain ball and a display simulating happiness. The music box was not on any counter. The photograph's back alley smelled like wet concrete and the small metal tang of a coin dropped in a drain. There were footprints in the dust, but no child's stride, only adult, anxious and small. I felt ridiculous and elated at once. It is a strange mixture, the feeling that you have found a friend in a city made of bricks. We left a note in the shop's door. "If you wind the box, please stop at the chapel." The note was childish and direct, and would probably have been ignored by anyone rational. I placed mine in a folded paper and tucked it under a lump of rock by the stoop. The rock was the kind of small kindness that people who go outside at night know how to find. We walked home in the dark and talked softly, like conspirators. Maeve said, "Maybe every person who tends an edge learns the habits that help. Maybe they need no instruction. Maybe this Lena is teaching someone else." "Or maybe someone else is teaching Lena," Oscar said.
Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. There was no oath, only notes and meetings, and the sense that attention was a scarce resource, and we were hoarding it in pockets. Sometimes I felt like a thief. Sometimes I felt like a lighthouse keeper. There are not many romantic metaphors for counting the intervals between hauntings. We kept the ledger because it made us behave like a community of recorders instead of a community of rumor. And then the music box disappeared. I found the empty case where I had left it, a drawer pulled open as if the world had inspected it and found nothing left. The key was gone from the ledger's page where I had placed it as a promise. The box's absence felt like a personal theft. Someone had taken it because the town needed it more than I did. Someone had stolen my compromise, the object I had hidden to prove that things could be kept apart from their keepers. I wrote that down. 07:04 a.m., home, music box missing. Smell, dust and old cardboard. Effect, anger like fever. Outcome, called Maeve. She said nothing at first. Then she said, maybe it found the person who needed it. Maybe it left the person who tried to hold it too tightly. Maybe there's an equilibrium. Maybe we'll find it. We looked. We left notes and checked windowsills and set traps of kindness. A note that said, if you have the box, please bring it to the chapel. No one replied. No one admitted it. The ledger held the empty space like a wound. That night, as I was closing the record, I received a message from an unknown number. It contained a single line.
You don't have to keep everything. There was no signature. The text could have been a threat. It could have been a consultation. It could have been Lena's grandmother turning over in a grave and closing a stitch. It could have been any of us. I put the phone down and listened for the lullaby. For the first time in months, it did not find me. The ledger under my bed has a page for the night the music box returned. I will not write that night down here in full. Some things are choicer when they are read in a cramped hand with loops of ink and cross-outs. I will say this. When we find the music box again, it is not with the same smoothness as the first time. There is a gouge on its lid, and inside the brass couple has one arm missing. The song it plays is the lullaby again, but it has been put together differently. A bar is missing, and another runs straight through where a memory has been brutally patched. When you listen to a song altered by absence, you hear the space the absence left as a movement of its own. We placed the box in the chapel's safe, as if salvation were a brass lock. Lena came and sat in the back pew and watched the candle wax like a person watching another person sleep. She did not speak. She did not need to. The ledger contains my admission later that week. I thought keeping things meant saving them. I was wrong. Keeping is not ownership. Keeping is custody.
J. Keeping is not ownership. Keeping is custody. The sentence felt like a confession and like a minor wisdom at once. We do not own the nights. The nights have their own ledger. We are merely scribes. I keep telling you these things because someone asked me to write them down, and because they are true. The world keeps habits, and sometimes you and I are the only ones who notice. If you hear a lullaby where there should be silence, write it down. If a candle flares when you think of a name, say the name aloud, and then set the candle back where it was. If the elevator counts to a number that's not there, press the real numbers and see whether the machine finds its way back to the right line. These are not rules of magic. They are common sense steps that ask you to be exact when the world is not. There are more entries in the ledger and more nights I could tell you about. A woman who snipped the fringe of a throw to keep a night's laughter from escaping. A man who left his watch on a pew to stop the clock from going backward. A radio that when two of us hummed in unison forgot how to be scary. There will be more nights because the town keeps teaching us to listen. If you ever hold a music box in the night and feel the urge to wind it, ask yourself whose hands learned that turn. Consider whether you are continuing a chain of care or merely playing at it. The difference is small and essential. I keep the ledgers under my bed because in the daytime the world seems greedy for explanation. At night, explanations are luxuries. Records are simple things: time, smell, effect, outcome. They do not fix everything. They do not promise wholeness. But they make you accountable in a quiet way. They force you to look. Someone wrote to me the other night, a person with a thin, careful hand, and said simply, "You find the music, and I write the name." The message attached no coordinates and no time.
only a promise. I do not know what we will do with that promise. I only know that it will be written somewhere. That is how I survive, by naming, by noting, by leaving a trail that someone might follow if they ever wanted proof that we tried. There is a sound now in the room where I write, the radiators whisper, the city breathing, a clock that seems to measure the space between beats. It is nearly midnight. Outside, the world folds its pockets and keeps its small things in for a while. The ledgers are closed for the night. The music box is for the moment still. If you have heard something in a place that should be quiet, tell me where and what time. I check my messages more than I should. I will read it at 2 a.m. with a thermos and a pen and the strange, steady hope that attention might make a difference.